Okay, here we're to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a really special feature for you guys. I haven't really put anything on the channel that is kind of more vintage. And I've really stayed away from things that are super luxury, apart from my latest Grand Seiko purchase and a few loaners that have come in from Belmont Watches. Today we're going to look at a really special piece that has a lot of sentimental value to me because it's part of kind of a family heirloom. It was originally my grandmother's and then my late mother's, and then she actually passed it down to my daughter. So this is a Rolex. A little bit about the brand if you haven't heard about them. They were founded by Hans Willdorf back in 1905 and officially registered as the brand name Rolex by 1908. They originally were out of London, England, and then Rolex would eventually be headquartered out of Geneva, Switzerland from 1920 and on. Now, in terms of the type of watch, I'd consider this an everyday dress watch. When you're looking for something that can be worn every day but still dressed up from time to time, some key common characteristics and design language you're going to want is something that's clean, classic, with a minimalist design, and something that is, of course, sensibly sized. This is an Air King Reference 5500, and it's considered an entry-level watch, and it was kind of part of the brand's early expansion. And it's actually the longest running reference in Air King history. It ran over 30 years from the late 1950s to the late 1980s, specifically introduced in 57 and then finally being replaced by 89 by the reference 14,000. So while the original 34 millimeter Air King may have been large by the standards of its era, the 5500 actually ran so long that it saw the size transition into, a more considerably petite piece. And yeah, today in 2022, it is quite small. I really enjoy this watch though. I'm fortunate I was able to have it recently serviced thanks to the guys over at Belmont Watches. And I have a couple other pieces on the table here just to kind of tie into the idea of family heirlooms, things that can be passed on, things that are overbuilt, and the fact that, yeah, this was overbuilt in the 80s, right? It's a real testament to Rolex quality, and obviously there's their market scarcity and that side of the house now, but in terms of a product, they've always been a very solid product. And yeah, so let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, guys, well, I know this isn't some super hot, horology piece or anything like that. This isn't some stunning Rolex. And honestly, these are probably some of the cheaper models to get because they are in a 34 millimeter size, which is a very particular kind of wear taste for folks today, at least those who are actually wearing these watches and collecting them. But it does have a lot of sentimental value, thinking about my grandmother wearing it, and then, my mother. I don't think she really wore it too much. I think she kind of just had it more sentimental value as a keepsake of her mom after she passed on. And then, yeah, I would like for this to get worn. I put it on a strap so it could get worn more often. So whether it be, my son or one of my sons, if they go with me to a watch meet, or eventually my daughter who's 6 now, or even having my wife wear it so that my daughter can feel more connected wearing her mother's and grandmother's and great-grandmother's watch. So we know the specs there in terms of the diameter. It is 34 millimeters, and it's a nice little petite watch. It is only 11.8 millimeters thick, and that is largely in part due to that high plexi box domed crystal there. And then it's only 39.5 millimeters lug to lug. It's stainless steel, brushed and polished. It has a, smooth fixed bezel there, and then it does have a signed screw-down crown. It's running the automatic Rolex caliber 1520, and it has a solid case back there, as you can see, which has been, you know, lovingly worn and touched up here and there over the years. Drilled lugs. The lug width on here is 19 millimeters, and the bracelet itself is still in great condition. With a good amount of links, I can actually extend it to the furthest portion. I can still get this around my larger 7.5 to 7.25 inch wrist. And you can see this is, you know, it's been touched up, but it's still very solid. Obviously, the clasp is very outdated in terms of the robustness and whatnot. The end links are hollow, but fit really well. And yeah, it's, again, nothing too flashy there, but it is something that has endured the test of time, and I can appreciate that. And, you know, the guys at Belmont Watches got it serviced, and they even brought it back in this cool little pouch. So I thought that was very nice. Now, in terms of this dial, it is really quite lovely. Let's get the camera to focus there, guys. It has a really great amount of wear to it. Of course, that's tritium that you're going to see there in terms of the lume, but it does have really nicely applied indices that are machined and beveled with lume plops around that outer edge. And then it has this kind of warm silvery sunray dial, which is really quite eye-catching. You do have these loomed pencil hands that have been polished. It's water resistant to 50 meters. So, you know, it's a little older, and I did put it purposely on a leather strap also to avoid it getting wet. Although the seals and everything are good to go, you know, we're just going to treat it like it is, treat it like its age. So it's not, you know, some new watch. But I think those 19 millimeter lugs do help make it quite wearable. Considering it's only 34 millimeters, it's actually quite a wide lug width, and that's probably what made it so wearable back in the day. So with that, actually, why don't we transition here so I can maybe get some a little bit more well-lit close-ups of this dial. Okay guys, so you can see a little bit more well lit and a little bit closer in there with a little kind of screw-on macro lens. Nothing serious, we're not going to be able to get too close in, but I do want to be able to show you guys some really interesting age that happened on this dial. You can see little spots of kind of warmth on there. Really quite lovely. And then even the markers, and from my reading, even the articles weren't able to confirm, but they did say that certain model years had white gold markers, and those had kind of tarnished over time and picked up more of kind of almost a yellowish gold tone. You know, apart from the ones that were yellow gold. And I think this might be one of those cases because the markers themselves, which do have some really nice machining texture on the top flats on the 3, 6, and 9, do have, I think, you know, I think they have picked up a little bit of that kind of golden hue to them without looking like actual, you know, blatant kind of gilt yellow gold. I think, you know, in most angles and most lighting situations, this really renders more as a silver tone, like a silver on silver. But, you know, you get a little closer, you get a little bit of light, and you do notice some very nice finishing there, nice little color play and a little warmth, and it definitely feeds into that vintage aesthetic there quite nicely. Also, you can see the crown nicely signed. You can see, you know, all the little imperfections there along the sides of the case. You can see the drilled lugs. You can see that crystal that has taken on quite of a life of its own. It's, you know, has some stories to tell. There's definitely something about this, and that's what I like. I really enjoy, and you guys know me, I'm not one who's really big on used watches or the vintage market in general. So this is really, you know, quite charmed me in a lot of unexpected ways. Of course, it has sentimental value, but it definitely has me feeling a certain kind of way about vintage watches in general. And I mean, this idea that, yeah, my grandmother, back in the 80s, early 80s, was able to purchase something like this. Yeah, I mean, that's cool. I mean, sure, they weren't cheap. I mean, they were definitely more accessible, but you could actually go in and buy a Rolex, and you didn't have to buy a bunch of other Rolexes you didn't want. You could say, hey, I like that one, and you could buy that one, which is kind of a trip compared to today's market where, the ADs have to really protect their inventory to kind of make sure that the gray market and the aftermarket aren't just flooded with units, kind of bringing down brand cachet. And yeah, with all of the Rolex kind of market deflation stories that are going on today, yeah, I think it's a nice little change of pace to talk about a Rolex here that has a different type of value, right? A personal value. And we don't hear enough stories about that. We hear about all these unattainable watches with all this great, massive resellability. And then, you have something here that I wouldn't resell. I'd keep, and and maybe years from now, a generation or two down the line, if they wanted to sell, then that's great for them. But me being, a watch guy, I can absolutely appreciate what this piece represents and the fact that it's still beating away. And yeah, I really dig that. So there aren't really any loom plots left. I mean, in terms of the luminosity and what they're going to be able to do, but I might as well get some low light transition. I know you guys love that, and maybe we can hit it with some black light to try to recharge, or at least so you guys can get a better idea of what this might have appeared like back in its heyday. Just realized I didn't even give you guys any on the wrist, and can't have an on the wrist from off the cuff segment without at least attempting. So as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, it wears quite small. Some of you might be looking at it and saying, hey, that's how a dress watch should wear. I will say, within the scale of a human and not just a talking wrist or hand, it does wear a bit small. But I think that, again, that 19mm lug width does help make it slightly more wearable. And you can see it rides the wrist really well. Great color palette, great tonality in terms of just the aesthetic overall. I think it's just a really underappreciated, it's a great look. And I think that this type of, kind of more sedate vintage styling is starting to come back, because for a long time a lot of the vintage stuff was a lot of the wild colors, all the pops and plays, but I think some of this earlier stuff, I mean, this model, although this is an 80s example, it did start back in the late 50s, so there's some mid-century vibes that are definitely within this particular reference number. And it looks really great. Maybe I put it on a black alligator strap and then it becomes extremely dressy. But I think in terms of something wearable, also the strap itself here, this is actually from B&R bands. So you guys know me. I do enjoy a good B&R band. I buy their stuff quite often. I don't really have any types of affiliations with them. I don't think they really market their stuff too heavily or anything like that. They have a steady flow of customers that come in, and I'm one of them. So you can see, I think it's a really nice layout there that does add a little bit of dressiness, but also adds it gives it a little bit of everyday character. It feels still quite robust without looking, playing into kind of the dressiness too much. So I think really cool on the daily there. Would I wear it? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it would really be a very particular situation that would call for something like this, and that's why I don't really own very many dress watches in general. So those are my thoughts. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. How does that look on my big hulking modern wrist? And I know, you guys like Muhammad Ali were wearing smaller watches, so when I'm sure he had a bigger wrist than mine. But yeah, I guess maybe it's just my modern eye looking at it, but it does have some absolute charm. But with that said, let's actually set up some loom shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, we'll go ahead and hit the lights here. Okay, as you can see, that tritium has died off and is pretty dim, but let me hit it with a little black light there. You can see what actually is loomed. You can also see, some lint particles there on the mat, but it fades relatively fast. But one thing that doesn't fade are, my interest in getting some low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to be coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, the shade of a tree, or maybe just spending some time in your favorite automobile. So it is nice to see what these colors and textures render like in less than optimal lighting, to include even some harsh lighting here that would typically expose, defects or whatnot. That typically don't get picked up in better lighting situations. And you can see, nothing crazy in terms of the brushing on, the finish on that original bracelet. But again, it's stood the test of time. You can still see that the light still plays and rolls over quite uniformly over that bracelet. And that dial really does pick up a lot of different light situations, which I can dig, and not in really obvious ways. It doesn't have some really high contrasty sun ray finish on the dial. It's a very muted kind of, it'll have a bit of a darker, two darker quadrants with a sliver that's a little bit wider and less vibrant than you'd find on something like a blue dial or a darker dial. But it's a very soft sunray finish that I think plays really, really well. And yeah, even without the loom, the nice thing is those indices are, quite tall and bold. And the way that they play with light, you're still going to get a nice contrast off that dial and be able to read. You can see, you can still read that time right there, right? Even with barely any light coming off of it. So I can dig that and appreciate that Rolex provided. Again, it's a tool watch. It's something that it's funny now because I'm like, maybe a dedicated dress watch. But yeah, it's a tool watch at the end of the day, right? It's an Air King, and it has a screw down crown, and it's meant to be out there and lived in and adventured with. So that's also part of, I guess a luxury or an heirloom type of piece, is it should be aspirational. And I think this hits that mark because it makes you want to wear it. It makes you want to, get it out in its environment and out in the elements. So, guys, closing thoughts on the wrist. Overall small proportions combined with that aggressive taper on the bracelet really make it, I'd say, pretty relatively unwearable on my wrist, although it fits. But I think the strap option helps kind of relegate it to a more dressy aesthetic. That is, I'd say, somewhat more wearable. But I think it'd probably be best peeking out from underneath a long sleeve cuff versus, me in a t-shirt and shorts rocking it like that. But again, let me know in the comments below. And, some of the other parts of my closing thoughts, talk about model variants and comparable models and kind of all that doesn't really apply here. But bottom line is, if you don't have a family heirloom, if you're a big watch collector and you don't have an heirloom piece, why not start one? It's not to say that your SKX or Turtle aren't already heirloom worthy, but I think it's kind of a fun idea to plan that out a little bit and consider generations ahead, as well as paying homage to the generations that came before you. So yeah, me as somebody who buys new modern watches, this was definitely a step outside of that. And yeah, I definitely have appreciated it over the time I've spent with it, and I look forward to, you know, seeing my kids, my wife, and, you know, eventually my young daughter spend a little bit of time with this piece. So if you guys have any cool stories about some pieces that are personal to you, again, this is technically like one of the cheapest Rolexes you can buy right now. So again, it's nothing crazy. It's not a Daytona. It's not associated with any movie star or, you know, event that happened at a national level. It's just a fun little piece that is absolutely a stunner when you give it a little bit of time. So let me know what you guys say in the comments below. If you liked the video, please do hit like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.